Toronto is the most populous city in Canada and the capital city of the Canadian province of Ontario. With a population of 2,794,356 in 2021-10, it is the fourth most populous city in North America. The city is the anchor of the Golden Horseshoe, an urban agglomeration of 9,765,188 people as of 2021, surrounding the western end of Lake Ontario, 11, while the Greater Toronto Area proper had a 2021 population of 6,712,341, 10. Toronto is an international center of business, finance, arts, sports, and culture, and is one of the most multicultural and cosmopolitan cities in the world. 14 Indigenous peoples have traveled through and inhabited the Toronto area, located on a broad sloping plateau interspersed with rivers, deep ravines, and urban forest, for more than 10,000 years. 15. After the broadly disputed Toronto Purchase, when the Mississauga surrendered the area to the British Crown. 16. The British established the town of York in 1793 and later designated it as the capital of Upper Canada. 17. During the War of 1812, the town was the site of the Battle of York and suffered heavy damage by American troops. 18. York was renamed and incorporated in 1834 as the City of Toronto. It was designated as the capital of the province of Ontario in 1867 during Canadian Confederation. 19. The city proper has since expanded past its original limits through both annexation and amalgamation to its current area of 630.2 square kilometers to 433 sq mi. The diverse population of Toronto reflects its current and historical role as an important destination for immigrants to Canada. 2021, about half of its residents were born outside of Canada, and over 200 ethnic origins are represented among its inhabitants. 22. While the majority of Torontonians speak English as their primary language, over 160 languages are spoken in the city. 23. The Mayor of Toronto is elected by direct popular vote to serve as the chief executive of the city. The Toronto City Council is a unicameral legislative body, comprising 25 councillors since the 2018 municipal election, representing geographical wards throughout the city. 24. Toronto is a prominent center for music. 25. Theatre. 26. Motion picture production. 27. And television production. 28. And is home to the headquarters of Canada's major national broadcast networks and media outlets. 29. Its varied cultural institutions. 30. Which include numerous museums and galleries, festivals, and public events, entertainment districts, national historic sites, and sports activities. 31. Attract over 43 million tourists each year. 32. 33. Toronto is known for its many skyscrapers and high-rise buildings. 34. In particular the CN Tower, the tallest freestanding structure on land outside of Asia. 35. The city is home to the Toronto Stock Exchange, the headquarters of Canada's 5 largest banks. 36. And the headquarters of many large Canadian and multinational corporations. Its economy is highly diversified, with strengths in technology, design, financial services, life sciences, education, arts, fashion, aerospace, environmental innovation, food services, and tourism. 38. 39. 40. Toronto is the third largest tech hub in North America after Silicon Valley and New York City, and the fastest growing hub. 41. Topony Miming article. Name of Toronto. Word Toronto has been recorded with various spellings in French and English, including Toronto, 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 and Toronton. 42. The most frequent early spelling, Toronto, referred to the Narrows, a channel of water through which Lake Simcoe discharges into Lake Couching, where the Huron had planted tree saplings to corral fish. This Narrows was called Kekaronto by the Mohawk, meaning where there are trees standing in the water. 43. 44. 45, and was recorded as early as 1615 by Samuel D. Champlain. 46. The word Toronto, meaning plenty, Also appears in a 1632 French lexicon of the Huron language, which is also an Iroquoian language. 47 also appears on French maps referring to various locations, including Georgian Bay, Lake Simcoe, and several rivers. 48 A portage route from Lake Ontario to Lake Huron running through this point, known as the Toronto Carrying Place Trail, led to widespread use of the name. The pronunciation of the city is broadly Toronto, T-Ronto, which locals pronounce no or no, leaving the second T silent. 49 50-51 History Main article, History of Toronto for a chronological guide. See Timeline of Toronto history. Early History Main article, History of Torontosi also. Amalgamation of Toronto. The site of Toronto lay at the entrance to one of the oldest routes to the northwest, a route known and used by the Huron, Iroquois, and Ojibwe. Archaeological sites show evidence of human occupation dating back thousands of years. The site was of strategic importance from the beginning of Ontario's recorded history. 52 In the 1660s, the Iroquois established two villages within what is today Toronto, Ganotsaquiegon Bead Hill on the banks of the Rouge River and Tieagan on the banks of the Humber River. By 1701, the Mississaugas had displaced the Iroquois, who abandoned the Toronto area at the end of the Beaver Wars, with most returning to their homeland in present-day New York State. 53 French traders founded Fort Royal in 1750. The current exhibition grounds were later developed there, but abandoned it in 1759 during the 7 Years' War. 54 The British defeated the French and their indigenous allies in the war, and the area became part of the British colony of Quebec in 1763. During the American Revolutionary War, an influx of British settlers arrived there as United Empire Loyalists fled for the British-controlled lands north of Lake Ontario. The Crown granted them land to compensate for their losses in the 13 colonies. The new province of Upper Canada was being created and needed a capital. In 1787, the British Lord Dorchester arranged for the Toronto Purchase with the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, thereby securing more than 250,000 acres 1,000 km2 of land in the Toronto area. 55. Dorchester intended the location to be named Toronto. 48. The first 25 years after the Toronto Purchase were quiet, although there were occasional independent fur traders present in the area, with the usual complaints of debauchery and drunkenness. 52. 1793, Governor John Graves Simcoe established the town of York on the Toronto Purchase lands, naming it after Prince Frederick, Duke of York, and Albany. Simcoe decided to move the Upper Canada capital from Newark, Niagara on the lake to York. 56, believing the new site would be less vulnerable to attack by the United States. 57. The York garrison was built at the entrance of the town's natural harbor, sheltered by a long sandbar peninsula. The town settlement formed at the harbor's eastern end, behind the peninsula, near the present-day intersection of Parliament Street and Front Street in Old Town area. 19th Centurion American squadron exchanging fire with Fort York during the Battle of York, 1813. The American landing is depicted to the west left foreground. In 1813, as part of the War of 1812, the Battle of York ended in the town's capture and plunder by United States forces. 58. John Strachan negotiated the town's surrender. American soldiers destroyed much of the garrison and set fire to the Parliament buildings during their 5-day occupation. Because of the sacking of York, British troops retaliated later in the war with the burning of Washington, D.C. York was incorporated as the city of Toronto on March 6, 1834, adopting the indigenous name. 59 Reformist politician William Lyon Mackenzie became the first mayor of Toronto. Mackenzie would later lead the unsuccessful Upper Canada Rebellion of 1837 against the British colonial government. Toronto's population of 9,000 included some African American slaves. Citation needed, some of whom had been brought by the Loyalists, and black Loyalists, whom the Crown had freed. Most of the latter were resettled in Nova Scotia. By 1834, refugee slaves from America's South were also immigrating to Toronto to gain freedom. 60 slavery was banned outright in Upper Canada and throughout the British Empire in 1834. 61 Torontonians integrated people of color into their society. In the 1840s, an eating house at Frederick and King Streets, a place of mercantile prosperity in the early city, was operated by a black man named Bloxham. 62 Toronto in 1854. The city was a major destination for immigrants to Canada in the second half of the 19th century. As a major destination for immigrants to Canada, the city grew rapidly through the remainder of the 19th century. The first significant wave of immigrants were Irish, fleeing the Great Irish Famine. Of them were Catholic. By 1851, the Irish-born population had become the largest single ethnic group in the city. The Scottish and English population welcomed smaller numbers of Protestant Irish immigrants, some from what is now Northern Ireland, which gave the Orange Order significant and long-lasting influence over Toronto society. Almost every mayor of Toronto was a member of the Orange Order between 1850 and 1950, and the city was sometimes referred to as the Belfast of Canada because of Orange influence in municipal politics and administration. 63. For brief periods, Toronto was twice the capital of the United Province of Canada, first from 1849 to 1851, following unrest in Montreal, and later from 1855 to 1859. After this date, Quebec was designated as the capital until 1865, 2 years before Canadian Confederation. Since then, the capital of Canada has remained Ottawa, Ontario. 64. The Second Parliament of Upper Canada building on Front Street, 1856. Toronto became the capital of the province of Ontario after its official creation in 1867. The seat of government of the Ontario briefly returned to the same building that hosted the Third Parliament building of Upper Canada, before moving to the Ontario Legislative Building at Queen's Park in 1893. Because of its provincial capital status, the city was also the location of Government House, the residence of the vice-regal representative of the Crown in right of Ontario. Long before the Royal Military College of Canada was established in 1876, supporters of the concept proposed military colleges in Canada. Staffed by British regulars, adult male students underwent a 3-month-long military course at the School of Military Instruction in Toronto. Established by Militia General Order in 1864, the school enabled officers of militia or candidates for commission or promotion in the militia to learn military duties, drill and discipline, to command a company at battalion drill, to drill a company at company drill, the internal economy of a company, and the duties of a company's officer. 65. The school was retained at Confederation in 1867. In 1868, schools of cavalry and artillery instruction were formed in Toronto. 66. A group in front of a horse-drawn streetcar in front of Yorkville Town Hall. 1870. A gas street lamp is visible in the right foreground. In the 19th century, the city built an extensive sewage system to improve sanitation, and streets were illuminated with gas lighting as a regular service. Citation needed. Long-distance railway lines were constructed, including a route completed in 1854 linking Toronto with the Upper Great Lakes. The Grand Trunk Railway and the Northern Railway of Canada joined in the building of the first Union Station in downtown. The advent of the railway dramatically increased the numbers of immigrants arriving. Commerce and industry has had the Lake Ontario steamers and schooners entering port before. These enabled Toronto to become a major gateway linking the world to the interior of the North American continent. Expanding port and rail facilities brought in northern timber for export and imported Pennsylvania coal. Industry dominated the waterfront for the next 100 years. During the late 19th century, Toronto became the largest alcohol distillation, in particular, spirit center in North America. By the 1860s, the Gooderham and Wirtz distillery operations became the world's largest whiskey factory. Citation needed. A preserved section of this once dominant local industry remains in the distillery district. The harbor allowed access to grain and sugar imports used in processing. The Gooderham and Wirtz buildings, 1896 horse-drawn streetcars gave way to electric streetcars in 1891 when the city granted the operation of the transit franchise to the Toronto Railway Company. The public transit system passed into public ownership in 1921 as the Toronto Transportation Commission, later renamed the Toronto Transit Commission. The system now has the third highest ridership of any city public transportation system in North America, 67. The other major geographical feature of Toronto is its escarpments. During the last ice age, the lower part of Toronto was beneath glacial Lake Iroquois. Today, a series of escarpments mark the lake's former boundary known as the Iroquois shoreline. The escarpments are most prominent from Victoria Park Avenue to the mouth of Highland Creek, where they form the Scarborough Bluffs. Other observable sections include the area near Ste Claire Avenue west between Bathurst Street and the Don River, and north of Davenport Road from Caledonia to Spadina Road. The Casa Loma grounds sit above this escarpment. 96. The geography of the lakeshore has dramatically changed since the first settlement of Toronto. Much of the land on the harbor's north shore is landfill, filled in during the late 19th century. Until then, the lakefront docks, then known as wharves, were set back farther inland than today. Much of the adjacent port lands on the harbor's east side was a wetland, filled in early in the 20th century. 97. The shoreline from the harbor west to the Humber River has been extended into the lake. Further west, landfill has been used to create extensions of land such as Humber Bay Park. View of the Toronto Islands, an island chain that bounds Toronto's inner harbor. The Toronto Islands were a natural peninsula until a storm in 1858 severed their connection to the mainland. 98. Creating a channel to the harbor. The peninsula was formed by longshore drift taking the sediments deposited along the Scarborough Bluffs shore and transporting them to the island's area. The other source of sediment for the Port Lands wetland and the peninsula was the deposition of the Don River, which carved a wide valley through the sedimentary land of Toronto and deposited it in the shallow harbor. The harbor and the channel of the Don River have been dredged numerous times for shipping. The lower section of the Don River was straightened and channeled in the 19th century. The former mouth drained into a wetland. Today, the Don River drains into the harbor through a concrete waterway, the Keating Channel. To mitigate flooding in the area, as well as to create parkland, a second, more natural mouth was built to the south during the first half of the 2020s, thereby creating a new island, Okwemen-Minizing. Neighborhoods and former municipalitizen articles, History of Neighborhoods in Toronto and List of Neighborhoods in Toronto. Map of Toronto with major traffic routes. Also shown are the limits of 6 former municipalities, which form the current city of Toronto. Toronto encompasses an area formerly administered by several separate municipalities that were amalgamated over the years. Each developed a distinct history and identity over the years, and their names remain in common use among Torontonians. Former municipalities include East York, Etobicoke, Forest Hill, Mimico, North York, Parkdale, Scarborough, Swansea, Weston, and York. Throughout the city, there exist hundreds of small neighborhoods and some larger neighborhoods covering a few square kilometers. Citation needed. The many residential communities of Toronto express a character distinct from the skyscrapers in the commercial core. Victorian and Edwardian-era residential buildings can be found in enclaves such as Rosedale, Cabbagetown, the NX, and Yorkville. 99. The Wychwood Park neighborhood, historically significant for the architecture of its homes, and for being one of Toronto's earliest planned communities, was designated as an Ontario Heritage Conservation District in 1985-100. The Casa Loma neighborhood is named after Casa Loma, a castle built in 1911 by Sir Henry Pellet, complete with gardens, turrets, stables, an elevator, secret passages, and a bowling alley. 101. Spadina House is a 19th-century manor that is now a museum. 102. Old Toronto Victorian-era bay and gable houses are a distinct architectural style of residence that is ubiquitous throughout the older neighborhoods of Toronto. The pre-amalgamation city of Toronto covers the downtown core and older neighborhoods to the east, west, and north. It is the most densely populated part of the city. The financial district contains the First Canadian Place, Toronto Dominion Centre, Scotia Plaza, Royal Bank Plaza, Commerce Court, and Brookfield Place. This area includes, among others, the neighborhoods of Steety Jamestown, Garden District, Steety Lawrence, Corktown, and Church and Wellesley. From that point, the Toronto skyline extends northward along Yonge Street. Citation needed. Old Toronto is also home to many historically wealthy residential enclaves, such as Yorkville, Rosedale, the Annex, Forest Hill, Lawrence Park, Lytton Park, Deer Park, Moore Park, and Casa Loma, most stretching away from downtown to the north. Citation needed. East and west of downtown, neighborhoods such as Kensington Market, Chinatown, Leslieville, Cabbagetown, and Riverdale are home to bustling commercial and cultural areas, as well as communities of artists with studio lofts, with many middle and upper class professionals. Citation needed. Other neighborhoods in the central city retain an ethnic identity, including two smaller Chinatowns, the Greektown area, Little Italy, Portugal Village, and Little India, among others. 103 Suburbs. Crescent Town and the surrounding area from the air. Crescent Town was a post-World War II suburban neighborhood developed in East York. The inner suburbs are contained within the former municipalities of York and East York. 104. These are mature and traditionally working-class areas, consisting primarily of post-World War, small, single-family homes, and small apartment blocks. 104 neighborhoods such as Crescent Town, Thorncliffe Park, Flemington Park, Weston, and Oakwood Village consist mainly of high-rise apartments, which are home to many new immigrant families. During the 2000s, many neighborhoods became ethnically diverse and underwent gentrification due to increasing population and a housing boom during the late 1990s and the early 21st century. The first neighborhoods affected were Leaside and North Toronto, gradually progressing into the western neighborhoods in York. Citation needed. In an attempt to curb suburban sprawl, many suburban neighborhoods in Toronto encouraged high-density populations by mixing housing lots with apartment buildings far from the downtown core. The outer suburbs comprising the former municipalities of Etobicoke West, Scarborough East, and North York North largely retain the grid plan laid before post-war development. 105 sections were long established and quickly growing towns before the suburban housing boom began and the emergence of metropolitan government. Existing towns or villages such as Mimico, Islington, and New Toronto in Etobicoke, Willowdale, Newtonbrook, and Downsview in North York, Agincourt, Wexford, and West Hill in Scarborough, where suburban development boomed around or between these and other towns beginning in the late 1940s. Upscale neighborhoods were built, such as the Bridle Path in North York, the area surrounding the Scarborough Bluffs in Guildwood, and most of central Etobicoke, such as Humber Valley Village and the Kingsway. One of the largest and earliest planned communities was Don Mills, parts of which were first built in the 1950s-106 phase development, mixing single detached housing with higher density apartment blocks, became more popular as a suburban model of development. During the late 20th century, North York City Centre and Scarborough City Centre developed separate downtown districts outside downtown Toronto after the former boroughs were promoted to cities. 107 high-rise development in these areas has given these former municipalities distinguishable skylines of their own, with high-density transit corridors serving them. Some of these developments are also transit-oriented. Citation needed. Industrial Distillery District holds the most extensive collection of preserved Victorian industrial architecture in North America. In the 1800s, a thriving industrial area developed around Toronto Harbour and the lower Don River mouth, linked by rail and water to Canada and the United States. Examples included the Gooderham and Worts Distillery, Canadian Malting Company, the Toronto Rolling Mills, the Union Stockyards and the Davies Pork Processing Facility the inspiration for the Hogtown nickname. 108-109. This industrial area expanded west along the harbor and rail lines, and was supplemented by the infilling of the marshlands on the east side of the harbor to create the port lands. A garment industry developed along Lower Spadina Avenue, the Fashion District. Beginning in the late 19th century, industrial areas were set up on the outskirts, such as West Toronto, the Junction, where the stockyards were located in 1903-110. The Great Fire of 1904 destroyed a large amount of industry in the downtown. Some companies moved west along King Street, and some moved as far west as Dufferin Street, where the large Massey Harris Farm Equipment Manufacturing Complex was located. 111. Over time, pockets of industrial land mostly followed rail lines and later highway corridors as the city grew outwards. This trend continues to this day. The largest factories and distribution warehouses are in the suburban environs of Peel and York regions, but also within the current city. Etobicoke concentrated around Pearson Airport, North York, and Scarborough. Citation needed. The West Don Lands is a former industrial site in downtown Toronto that has undergone redevelopment. Many of Toronto's former industrial sites close to or in downtown have been redeveloped, including parts of the Toronto waterfront, the rail yards west of downtown, and Liberty Village. The Massey Harris District, and large-scale development is underway in the West Don Lands. Citation needed. The Gooderham and Worts distillery produced spirits until 1990, and is preserved today as the Distillery District, the largest and best preserved collection of Victorian industrial architecture in North America. 112. Some industry remains in the area, including the Redpath Sugar Refinery. Similar areas that retain their industrial character but are now largely residential are the Fashion District, Corktown, and parts of South Riverdale and Leslieville. Toronto still has some active older industrial areas, such as Brockton Village, Mimico, and New Toronto. In the west end of Old Toronto and York, the Weston or Mount Dennis and the Junction areas still contain factories, meat packing facilities and rail yards close to medium-density residential. However, the Junction's Union Stockyards moved out of Toronto in 1994. 110. The Brownfield industrial area of the Port Lands, on the east side of the harbor, is one area planned for redevelopment. 113. Formerly a marsh that was filled in to create industrial space, it was never intensely developed. Its land and suitable for large-scale development because of flooding and unstable soil. 114. It still contains numerous industrial uses, such as the Portland's Energy Center power plant, port facilities, movie and television production studios, concrete processing facilities, and low-density industrial facilities. The Waterfront Toronto Agency has developed plans for a naturalized mouth to the Don River and to create a flood barrier around the Don, making more of the land on the harbor suitable for higher-value residential and commercial development. 115. A former chemicals plant site along the Don River is slated to become a large commercial complex and transportation hub. 116. Architecture. Article Architecture of Toronto. See also List of oldest buildings and structures in Toronto and List of tallest buildings in Toronto. Rosalie Sharp Center for Design.